Hi. So a lot of people talk to me about glazing and want to know more about glazing and oil painting. And when I'm talking about glazing, I'm talking about using a thin, transparent paint to change both the tone and the colour of a painting, as opposed to glazing with glass. So glazing is not varnishing. That's an important thing to say. So the glazing technique is about using a transparent or a semi-transparent paint, typically a transparent pigment, and using it very, very thin, really just using a pigmented medium, and using that as a way of either washing certain areas of the canvas or painting certain areas of the canvas. But with a glaze, we're darkening everything because we're using pigment, and we're using that pigment, that transparent pigment, to shift the tonal values down, and also to shift maybe the colour slightly as well. And this is how artists would have used glazing in grisaille, in traditional artwork, where they would have painted everything in monochrome, and many artists obviously still work this way, but certainly the classical artists of the past would have painted, especially figurative work, drapery and so on. Whenever we see this beautiful drapery that has beautiful greens and reds and browns and so on, and blues in particular, that would have been applied with a glaze. One question that comes up frequently when I'm teaching classes and teaching students is, can you glaze in white? Well, the obvious answer to that seems to be, of course not, because the glaze is there designed to darken. And when you're using white, and especially when you're using a glaze, you're using the opposite method, which is known as scumbling. And that's where scumbling and glazing become a balance between the two techniques. And a scumble is the complete opposite to a glaze, in that you're using opaque white or light coloured paint across the top of a darker, normally a glazed piece, to create that three-dimensional image. But the important thing with the scumble is that a scumble is either fully opaque or semi-opaque. Sometimes you'll still see something through the scumble, especially if you're using it within clouds, but it's designed to lighten a painting. So coming back to this question, can we glaze with white? And we can, and there's one thing that we can do with white, is that we can thin that white down, and we can use that to help us to unify the painting. And I'm using this piece as an example. It's a commission I'm working on at the moment, and the colours, as you can see, are very intense, very rich and very dark. So by putting a very thin wash, if you like, of a very light paint, and in particular I'd be using I'd be using Zinc White, and I'll explain more of that in a moment. But the reason we would use that is to allow us to enable to unify the piece. Some people would say, well, for instance, if this band here is too dark, if the colour saturation you've chosen is too dark, and my tones are correct here, it's just the colours are a bit strong and I want to cool them down. But I've painted it in this way for a particular reason. Some people would ask the question, well, why wouldn't you simply just use the right colour and tone of paint in the first instance? Why go through the process of painting a picture and then having to correct or adjust it by using either a glaze or a scumble? And as I've just said, there's a very good reason for doing that. And that is because when we use a glaze or a scumble in certain ways, we're able to provide more unity and to actually unify the painting. And hopefully I'm going to be able to demonstrate that with this piece. So I'm going to lighten certain areas, but in particular where these harder edges are, and in particular the very high colour contrasts that I have, not tonal contrast, but the contrast of colour, of warm and cool colours, I want to shift those and soften those and make the piece appear more realistic. And especially with a view like this, a sunset at sea, where I want everything to soften, this is at the moment too hard. Now, again, other people would say, well, why wouldn't you just simply blend? And blending is a very different thing altogether, because blending is about removing edges. Blending is about creating tonal gradation and breaking edges. So if I'm working with wet paint, I can use a soft brush, my finger, a cloth, whatever, typically a soft bristled brush, and I can smooth out and I can break hard shapes and edges and I can blend them. Blending is an amazing thing, and it's one of the things that a lot of people get a lot of pleasure from when they're painting in oils, is this ability to produce beautiful, soft, subtle gradations of tone and colour through blending techniques. But the problem with that is frequently people overblend, and they actually blend everything out. Because blending is so effective, they blend a small area of the painting, they look at it, they like it, I'll blend some more. They blend a bit more out, and so on and so on. And of course, the point with a blend is that the softness of that painting only really has an effect if it's if it's contrasted against something that's sharper. So when we're painting with oils, we don't necessarily always want to blend everything out. Some people do, that's their technique, it's their style, and everything is very, very softly blended, everything is very diffuse, and there's nothing in there really that has any very hard, strong elements. So as opposed to blending, and where I could have blended certain things, it's not the softness or the hardness that I'm trying to adjust by doing this. It's going to be about unifying all of the painting by giving it essentially a soft wash. Not the whole thing, but certain elements I'm going to give it a very, very soft wash with zinc white. And by doing that, in an essence, I am glazing because I'm using a pigment very, very thinly within the medium. And it's predominantly the medium that I'm applying with a little bit of pigment rather than paint pigment with a little bit of medium. So by doing this, what I'm able to do is to use that technique, that soft white glaze, if you like, as a method of reducing the harshness or the contrasts of certain elements, and also to create some unity. So it doesn't look as if it's a painting that's been painted in pieces and then assembled, but rather it presents more as a whole. But at the same time, by not blending, I'm not losing any of my hard edges, because as we'll see, those hard edges will show through. And it should just be a soft, subtle improvement, but certainly a noticeable one. So I'm going to use this piece as an example, and the next piece I'm going to show you how I'm applying it and then what the end result looks like. So here I'm using zinc white, and as I just mentioned a moment ago, there's a particular reason why I would choose this paint over something else. Most people's immediate choice would be titanium or soft mixing white, or flake white in particular, which is one of my favourites, which has got a much creamier, slightly yellow edge to it, not quite as sharp and as piercing as a titanium white. But flake white is something that a lot of people ask me about because they use it and they're not quite sure why they use it, and I'm going to explain the reason for zinc white. Zinc white has a semi-transparent quality, which means that when we thin that down, in particular when we thin that down with medium, and in this case I'm using liquid. Liquid is a good standard medium. It means you have a pre-prepared, fully mixed medium. You don't have to adjust or balance between the lean and the fat. It's an accelerant, so it dries clear, it dries without any colour cast as well. But what I'm looking to do is to use this zinc white and to really thin that down with the medium to get that quite soft. And you can probably already see that that is a semi-transparent or translucent paint. And the thinner I take that and the more medium that I use, the thinner I can keep that glaze or that wash. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe we should really describe this more as a wash rather than a true glaze, because glazing really is all about darkening a piece, reducing the tonal value, and then also shifting the colour. And that's probably about as thin as I would go, possibly even a little bit thinner than that, because I really want to work at it lightly. And the same process applies with using this method. Just as with a glaze, the trick is always to use a less glaze than you assume, because once that's dried, you can then get how the glaze has worked. And if it's not satisfactory, you can always increase it and do more. But what you can't do is you can't take paint off. So it's always better to remember that as you're working in a layered method with oil paint, work step by step and then give yourself the opportunity to add an additional layer to improve and refine and resolve any issues in the painting that you want to. But don't go in too hard to start with. But this is zinc white, very, very thinly, and we're going to see how that now applies as I work that over the painting to just give that a lovely, soft, diffuse element, but at the same time still keeping the harder edges in the painting, the formal strength and the marks that I want to retain. So this is now where the Bravery Test comes in, because I'm going to be putting white paint over the top of everything I've done, and obviously I want to make sure that I don't lose the quality of the work that's already in there, but I know I need to adjust it. And as I said, this is the purpose of the exercise, is I deliberately put these stronger, bolder colours in because I wanted to use this soft white glaze over the top. The thing to remember is to work with the areas where you're going to start with the lightest area and then to stretch your thin white glaze, your wash, out from that area. I'm using a soft bristle brush. I'm using a square bright for no particular reason, but it's a soft bristle brush. And that paint, remember, is quite thin, almost to the point of being very, almost kind of milky. And as I apply this soft wash over the top, you can see it's starting to shift some of the tones. It's starting to lighten, and as I said, I'm working the lightest areas first. Now, obviously, and it's very important to remember, this only happens on a fully dry painting. This is not something that you would do in any way wet on wet. You need to be able to apply this in such a way, because the other benefit with this method is that we can also remove the paint if we don't like it. If we really don't like it, and as long as this painting is bone dry, or as dry as we would normally expect to work over it, I can remove some of this with, if necessary, extra medium. I can use thin medium, just clear medium, and wash that away. But really what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to use that soft white, and you can see as it goes on, it'll also knock the sheen back a little bit, but remember, as I'm adding this paint, because it's white, because it's wet, it's going to make it look a little bit shinier. And certainly the image you're possibly seeing on the screen there is not particularly true to life, because you're seeing colours more saturated through the camera lens than I'm seeing them with the naked eye, and you would see them if you were here with me as well at the moment. But this area in particular is the area that I want to really kind of start to soften. And you can see that as I do that, it now starts to break some of these edges up and just allows me to bring some of these areas together and to unify them. And it's not really killing the darks off too much. The darks are still there, but what's happening is the transition between the areas has greater unity, and that makes the painting appear a lot softer, and I would argue a little bit more realistic in terms of being closer to the natural world. Now hopefully you can see, I haven't changed any lighting in here, the position of the camera is the same, everything else is the same, so hopefully now you can see from the previous version how that has softened. And you can see I haven't done a great deal to it, but it's cooled everything off. It's given that opacity, a slight opacity, which in particular for some paintings, you know, and certainly when you're painting something later in the year where you want to create that kind of misty quality, this would be ideal as well if you were painting sort of views through misty trees or a misty landscape, and you just realize that you need to soften everything off a little bit. This method of, let's call it a wash rather than a glaze, of using zinc white, and it's only zinc white you want to be using for this, because it has this transparency, this translucency. Don't use titanium, or you can use titanium or flake, but you'd have to thin it down enormously, where the zinc you'll be able to retain the amount of white that you're adding, but still have this transparent effect. And in particular here, where I'm working along the boundary, the borderline between land and sea, we all know what that looks like in an evening when we've got a certain degree of a sea fret or a mist, and it's nice and soft. It's also very useful for softening edges as well as softening away edges as well, because by softening those edges away, we're diffusing the image, which is helping to bring the viewer's eye in closer. And I'm not going to go any lower into the main body of the water here, because I want to now start to paint in the crests of the waves and complete the waves on the beach at the front. But hopefully that's a quick example of showing you how you can indeed glaze, if we're going to call it that, we're going to use that term, how you can glaze with white. So again, it's zinc white. In this instance, the medium I'm using is liquin. You could obviously use a standard traditional oil mix with turpentine, or any of the other painting mediums that you choose to use, but I must stress it needs to be very, very thin. And as you can also see, you know, I'm definitely not trying to paint every single cloud with the white. I'm actually washing the canvas, and in particular I'm just adding a little bit more to the areas where I feel I want it to be that little bit brighter. And that has now softened the painting off considerably, and it's given it exactly the look that I was hoping for. So give it a try. If you've got a painting that you put to one side that maybe you're not so happy with, and you've left it to rest for a while you're thinking about what to do with it, maybe think about using a soft white wash across that and see if that helps to unify the piece. And remember, I can always go back in and reset my darks once this is dry. And this will dry fairly rapidly because it's predominantly all medium. So in the case of liquid on a relatively warm time of the year, 24-48 hours, and this piece will be dry enough to be able to work the next layer over, and then you could reset some of those darks again if you wanted to, or indeed start to push some of the lights just that little bit lighter. Glazing with white. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. So having now put the lighter elements in for my waveforms, I'm keeping them quite, not abstract, but I'm trying again not to paint every single wave crest in, I'm just trying to create the effect. I also now have my wet sand to the foreground, and I want to just sort of soften that a little bit again, using the same effect by just using small amounts of the zinc white, just to knock off any of those really sort of hard elements, but to keep the contrasts underneath, and then to complete and hopefully unify the picture.